So, here's a question for you. How does a scholar, a guy with a PhD, end up with a prison sentence for retweeting some posts? It sounds pretty wild, right? Well, that's the puzzle at the heart of what we're digging into today, looking at the legal arguments and some really deep analysis of this whole case. And to really get a handle on this, we've got to start with this quote. The analysis we're looking at says this isn't just about one person's legal troubles. No, it's about something much bigger, a struggle for the freedom to think. The idea here is that the biggest threat isn't always the obvious one, like prison. It's when people just get used to not being free to think for themselves.
All right, so let's just lay out the bare-bones facts here. What actually happened? For a few years, Dr. Chen Jingyuan, a scientist, was doing what millions of people do, retweeting stuff on Twitter. Nothing crazy. Then, bam, September 2022, the police show up and arrest him. A few months later, he's sentenced to 1 year and 8 months for something called picking quarrels and provoking trouble. And get this, the appeal was shot down just a month later, without even holding a hearing.
Okay, so how on earth does a court justify a prison sentence for retweeting? The official charge, again, was picking quarrels and provoking trouble. So let's deconstruct this crime, right? Let's break down what the prosecution actually had to prove according to the legal analysis we're drawing from.
Now, based on the source analysis, this isn't some simple open and shut case. To get a conviction, the prosecution had to jump through 3 pretty specific legal hoops. First, they had to prove the stuff he shared was just plain false. Second, they had to prove that he knew it was false when he hit retweet. And third, they had to show that his actions actually caused a serious disruption to public order. That's a high bar.
And this is where it gets really interesting. Remember that second hurdle? Proving what Dr. Chen actually knew? Well, instead of showing any evidence, the court's reasoning was basically this. He has a PhD. He's a highly educated guy, so he should have known it was false. Now hold on a second. That flies right in the face of a basic legal principle, which says you can't just assume someone's guilty because of their job or their education.
So this whole legal breakdown leads to a much bigger, deeper question, doesn't it? Why such a massive reaction to such a tiny action? The source material we're looking at has this fascinating idea. It suggests we should look at this through the lens of chaos theory. The argument is that maybe this isn't really about the law at all, but about a deep-seated fear of things you can't control.
Okay, so first, we need to get our heads around this one key idea from complexity science. The idea is that a society isn't like a car engine, where you know exactly what each part does. It's more like a living ecosystem, a complex adaptive system. It's a dynamic web of connections that's always changing and evolving. And the key thing is, real stability in a system like that doesn't come from rigid control. It comes from being flexible and listening to feedback.
And that, of course, brings us to the famous butterfly effect. You've probably heard of it, right? The idea that a butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil could, theoretically, set off a chain of events that leads to a tornado in Texas. It's all about how in these complex systems, a tiny little input can get amplified and create huge, totally unpredictable results down the line.
So the analysis in our source material argues this case is a perfect example of that. You have this tiny initial event, Dr. Chen's tweet, which is like the butterfly's flutter. And then you have the system's reaction, the arrest, the trial, the prison sentence, which is like a Category 5 hurricane. The system reacted to a tiny flutter as if it was a catastrophic storm. And that, the argument goes, reveals a profound fear of any disturbance, no matter how small.
All right, let's shift gears a bit. The source material doesn't just use modern science to look at this. It also zooms way out, looking at this case through the lens of centuries of history and the traditional role of the scholar.
The analysis brings in the work of historian Yu Ying Shi, who frames this whole thing as a really ancient conflict. See, there's this traditional role of the independent scholar, the Shi. For centuries, their job wasn't to serve the people in power. Their job was to be the conscience of society, to speak the truth, because their duty was to a higher principle, not to any particular ruler.
And you can see this pattern repeating throughout history. It's pretty incredible. The source connects what happened to Dr. Chen to a long line of intellectuals who got in trouble for doing their job. We're talking about figures like Sima Qian, who wrote a history that didn't just parrot what the emperor wanted to hear, or Ku Yuan, who was exiled for speaking truth to power. In this view, Dr. Chen simply sharing information outside the official narrative is just the modern-day version of this ancient tradition.
Okay, so we've looked at this through a legal lens, a scientific one with the butterfly effect, and a historical one. So what happens when you put it all together? What's the big idea? Well, the source suggests that this case tells us a lot about the difference between a justice system that's alive and one that's, well, dead.
And that leads us to a really fundamental question posed by the analysis. If we think of justice as a living thing, not just a dusty old rulebook, then what does it need to survive? What are its vital signs? So, according to the source, a healthy, living system has 3 key vital signs. First, there's openness. It has to be able to take in new information, even criticism. Second, it needs feedback. It has to see dissenting opinions not as a threat, but as a crucial signal telling it how to get better, how to self-correct. And finally, there's moral resonance. This is a big one. It means the system's decisions have to actually feel fair and just to the people living in that society.
Now, when you use that checklist to look at the Chen case, the conclusion from the analysis is pretty stark. The system was basically a closed loop. Openness? 0%. Feedback? 0. Moral resonance? 0. The only thing operating was 100% top-down control. It basically shut out all the things that keep a justice system alive and healthy.
So after all that, the legal details, the science, the history, what's the final takeaway here? What's the one big thought we're left with? Well, the final, really provocative idea that the source analysis leaves us with is this. A system that's afraid of feedback has, in a way, already passed sentence on itself. When a system chooses perfect, silent order over the messy but vital process of listening and correcting itself, it isn't healthy. It's just brittle. It's a system that's so scared of a butterfly's flutter that it brings out a sledgehammer. And in doing so, it might not be showing its strength, but its own fatal weakness.